The hollow below, the wind howled across the ragged cliffs of Blackthorn Canyon, a deep and desolate scar carved into the earth where even the hardiest of desert creatures dared not linger too long, and the 5 figures standing at the brink of that jagged abyss could not have known, could not have imagined, that by nightfall, their names would mean nothing, their bones would be scattered deep below, and the desert itself would have feasted on the remains of their terror. The sun was still high when they began the descent. Jared, the self-appointed leader with a permanent smirk and restless eyes, Ellie, wiry and sharp-tongued but already sweating through her t-shirt in the oppressive heat, Marcus, the quiet one, camera slung over one shoulder, expression distant, always watching through glass instead of eyes, Ray, the sarcastic skeptic, already lighting his 3rd cigarette before they even started. And Lila, the last, the quietest, the one who hung at the back of the group with downcast eyes and restless hands, as though she could feel, somehow, already, what waited below. The path wound downward, narrow and crumbling, the canyon walls sheer and slick with ancient mineral veins that glistened like wounds in the rock, and as they moved, the air seemed to shift around them. Cooler despite the sun, thinner despite the altitude, as though they were being swallowed inch by something vast and invisible, something waiting. Ellie was the first to speak the unspoken. "This place feels wrong," she muttered, adjusting her pack, squinting up at the walls. "Like, off. You guys feel that? Like the hills have eyes?" Ray smirked, exhaling smoke, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yeah. Spooky desert vibes. Typical." Marcus said nothing, just raised his camera, snapping photo after photo of the warped stone, the twisted juniper trees clinging to life on impossible ledges, the strange symbols, barely noticeable, scratched into the stone, circles with lines through them, triangles overlapping, spirals that ended in broken teeth like jagged edges. No one knew who had carved them. The area wasn't marked on any map, and the stories they'd heard from the nearest town. Tales of people who vanished without a trace, of strange lights, of bodies found half buried with expressions twisted in permanent, silent screams, were half the reason they'd come in the first place. Adventure. Thrills. Something to post online. But by the time the sun began to dip behind the canyon's rim, the laughter had died out, and the shadows had grown fat and black and hungry. They made camp on a wide ledge that jutted out over nothingness, the drop beneath it sheer and infinite. The rocks there were oddly smooth, polished as if by countless hands, and the shapes of the cliffs beyond formed something that looked, in the right light, unnervingly like a face, a hollow-eyed, open-mouthed mask stretched across the land itself. They lit a fire. Ate. Drank cheap whiskey passed from hand to hand. But none of them could shake the unease. The wind carried strange sounds, whispers, almost, too low to understand but too distinct to ignore. And then, somewhere in the deep, a low sound rose, vibrating, distant at first but rising in strength, a guttural, unearthly chant, wordless but full of intention. Not human. Not right. Jared was the first to stand, peering into the black. "You guys hear that?" Everyone nodded, frozen. The sound grew louder, closer, echoing off the stone, disorienting, wrapping around them. And then they saw it. A figure. At the edge of the firelight, barely visible. A pale shape, human in form but wrong in movement, limbs jerking in stuttering spasms, head cocked too far to one side, face smeared dark with something wet, something that gleamed black-red in the fire's glow. "Who the hell?" Jared started forward. "No," Lila whispered. "Don't," but it was too late. The thing moved. Faster than anything that Broken should have. It closed the distance in seconds, hands outstretched, hands that ended in jagged, torn nails, stained black to the wrist. The first scream was Jared's. It tackled him, teeth flashing in the dark, no weapons, just teeth and nails and feral, inhuman strength, and the others barely had time to react before blood sprayed, hot and bright across the stones. Ellie's flashlight beam caught the thing's face as it tore at Jared's throat, white, eyeless socket staring sightlessly, mouth pulled into a permanent, rictus grin, lips peeled back to the gums, flesh stitched crudely at the corners. It wasn't a mask. It wasn't human. It wasn't alive. They ran. Blind through the dark, stumbling down ancient paths, crashing through twisted roots, their lungs burning with panic and cold, until at last, somehow, they collapsed together in a narrow stone crevice, gasping, shaking, Jared's scream still ringing in their ears. The thing did not follow. The chanting had stopped. Only the wind remained. Ellie sobbed, hands over her mouth. Ray sat with his back to the stone, blood splattered across his shirt, his eyes wide and empty. Marcus clutched his camera to his chest, rocking slightly, whispering to himself. Lila knelt in the dirt, her hands buried in the soil, her breath ragged. "It's the canyon," she whispered, barely audible. "It's inside the canyon." They didn't sleep. Couldn't. The sky above seemed too dark, the stars too distant, the very air wrong, as though the canyon itself were alive. Watching, breathing, waiting. And somewhere, deep below, something vast and ancient began to stir. The morning that followed what remained of the first night was not truly morning at all but something else, something wrong with the sky itself. As though the sun, like the canyon, had been distorted, its light twisted into a sickly amber haze that bled across the stone walls in sluggish waves, and when the 4 remaining survivors finally stumbled from their makeshift hiding place, they did so as husks, pale, shivering, their nerves frayed to threads that sang with the memory of Jared's screams. No one spoke at first. The desert stretched out before them in broken teeth and ragged stone, the narrow paths now somehow alien, as though the land itself had shifted in the night, rearranging its veins and bones while they slept, or rather, failed to sleep, in restless fits, their dreams plagued by visions of hollow-eyed faces and gaping mouths that spoke in the grinding language of stone. Ray lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, the tip of it burning too fast, his breath hitching when he exhaled. "That thing," he said finally, voice hollow, "it wasn't human. You saw it. You all saw it." Ellie's eyes were rimmed red, her hands shaking as she adjusted the straps of her pack. "We need to get out. We can't," she swallowed, throat dry. "We can't stay here." But the canyon did not want them to leave. The path upward, their only way back, was gone. Where the narrow trail should have wound along the cliffs, there was now only a sheer drop into nothingness, as if the very ground had been swallowed in the night, devoured by the canyon's shifting heart. The stone at the edge was fresh, jagged, wet, bleeding a dark viscous liquid that reeked of rust and rot. Marcus, silent until now, lifted his camera to his eye as though the lens might provide distance from the horror, but when he looked through it, his breath caught, and his face twisted into a mask of pure, white terror. "It's changing," he whispered. "The rock, it's moving." And it was. Subtly at first, but unmistakably, the canyon walls pulsed, ever so slightly, with an organic rhythm, as if the very stone itself were breathing. Ellie screamed when she saw it. Ray dropped his cigarette. Lila, pale as milk, whispered under her breath in a language none of them recognized, her eyes glassy and unfocused. They ran, without direction, without thought, scrambling down slick stone paths, slipping on gravel that shifted underfoot like skin over muscle, until they stumbled upon it, a pit, wide and circular, carved into the earth like an infected wound, its edges blackened and soft, the stone around it glistening with a wet sheen of crimson. At its center, the remains of something once human. Or perhaps something only pretending to be human. The figure's skin had been peeled from its face, leaving behind glistening red muscle pulled tight over grinning bone, and its arms were arranged at impossible angles, disjointed, broken, then reassembled into a mockery of life. The ribcage was pried open like the petals of a flower, its organs displayed, glistening and wet, but still pulsing, still beating, as if some dark power within the pit kept the flesh alive. Marcus retched, falling to his knees. Ellie covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Ray whispered, "What the fuck is this?" Lila stepped forward. Her eyes were wrong. Wide. Unblinking. "They're feeding it," she murmured softly, almost reverently. "Piece by piece." The others turned to her, confusion and terror merging into one, but Lila only smiled, a small, distant thing, and pointed to the pit where the body twitched on invisible strings. "It's been hungry for so long," she whispered. "But it remembers." The chanting began again. Low at first. Distant. And then closer. All around. Dozens, no, hundreds, of voices rising from the very rock itself, from the air, from the bones of the canyon, until the sound was deafening. A guttural, pulsing wave of voices, wordless yet full of meaning. The earth shuddered beneath them. Marcus screamed, short and sharp, as the ground split open beneath his feet. He fell sideways, arms flailing, and the others grabbed for him, but too late. His body was swallowed by the stone, vanishing in an instant, leaving behind only the echo of his voice, his camera clattering uselessly to the blood-slick ground. Ellie collapsed, sobbing. Ray pulled her upright, his own face pale and bloodless. "We have to move," he rasped. "Now." But Lila didn't move. She stood motionless, her fingers twitching at her sides, her lips moving in silent mimicry of the ancient chant, her eyes rolling back into her skull until only the whites showed. A thin line of blood ran from her nose, down her chin. When Ellie shook her, she convulsed, once, twice, and then vomited black fluid across the ground. In the fluid, teeth. Dozens of small, jagged human teeth, rattling across the stone like macabre dice. Her voice came thin and distant, but it was not her own. "Beneath," she said in a hoarse, broken rasp. "It waits." Without warning, her head snapped back, and she let out a sound that was not a scream but something far worse, a laugh, wet and bubbling, as her jaw unhinged unnaturally wide and something moved beneath the flesh of her neck. Bulging, writhing, as if something inside her was trying to claw its way free. Ray grabbed Ellie's arm. "We have to leave her. We have to go." Ellie shook her head, sobbing, but when Lila's skin began to split, thin hairline cracks forming across her arms, her throat, her cheeks, dark blood seeping from beneath as her body convulsed, they ran. They ran blindly through the twisted maze of stone and shadow, their screams swallowed by the chanting, by the rumble of living rock, by the sound of flesh tearing somewhere behind them. They did not stop. They could not stop. Because behind them, something had awakened. And it was hungry. The walls of the canyon had become a living nightmare, the stone no longer inert but slick and breathing beneath their fingertips, oozing with thick, viscous fluids that smelled like iron and decay, as if the earth itself had bled open to reveal some horrid, pulsing wound beneath. The survivors, Ellie and Ray, stumbled forward, their bodies numb from exhaustion and their minds fraying at the edges, every nerve screaming that the horror was far from over. Behind them, Lila's guttural laugh echoed faintly, distorted by distance, a sickening melody of madness that tore at their sanity. Her form had twisted into something grotesque, her bones cracking and reshaping beneath cracked skin as black veins pulsed and writhed like living worms just under the surface. She was no longer human, if she ever had been, but a vessel for the canyon's ancient hunger. Ellie's breath hitched as she reached out, brushing her fingers against a strange, pulsing cavity carved into the canyon wall, a hole that seemed alive, wet and warm to the touch, lined with soft, translucent tissue that flexed and pulsed rhythmically like a heartbeat. It was a well of flesh, a grotesque altar of raw, throbbing muscle embedded in stone. Ray reached out beside her, trembling. "We need to keep moving," he urged, voice breaking, but Ellie couldn't tear her gaze away from the pulsating wound in the rock. Something inside her twisted, an instinctual terror mixed with a sick, inexplicable fascination. The walls began to close in, shrinking the path ahead as tendrils of raw sinew crept like vines, crawling over the rock faces and reaching toward them, slick and glistening with mucus and blood. The air thickened, heavy with the coppery stench of fresh blood and the sharp bite of ancient rot. Ellie stumbled backward, her foot catching on a thick, writhing cord of flesh snaking along the ground, and she fell hard onto the jagged stones. Pain flared, raw and hot, but she had no time to scream before the tendrils lunged, wrapping around her ankles like living ropes, pulling with a terrible, suffocating strength. Ray lunged to help, slashing blindly with his pocketknife, but the flesh around Ellie writhed and tightened, the grip unbreakable. A terrible gurgling sound filled the air, like the earth itself was choking, and then, from the depths below, a guttural roar echoed up, a sound not just of pain but of triumph and ancient fury. Ray pulled harder, but the canyon claimed Ellie like a predator devouring its prey, dragging her toward the pulsating well of flesh embedded in the rock, where dozens of sharpened bone-like spikes jutted grotesquely, stained red with old and fresh blood. Ellie's screams were muffled as the tendrils wrapped around her waist, lifting her slowly, inexorably into the maw of the living wall, her fingers clawing desperately at the slimy flesh, her eyes wide with terror. Ray's vision blurred with tears and rage. He slashed and hacked at the grotesque flesh, but the canyon's hold was relentless. Then, as Ellie's body disappeared into the fleshy cavity, something shifted deep within the well, something vast and unseen stirring awake. A deep vibration thrummed through the stone and flesh, shaking loose dust and shattered rock. From somewhere below, the canyon itself seemed to inhale, deep and slow, and then let out a guttural, monstrous exhale that echoed through the labyrinthine chasms. Ray was thrown back, crashing hard onto the cold stone, his ears ringing and his vision swimming. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum of war. Ellie's screams were cut off suddenly, replaced by a terrible silence. Ray scrambled to his feet, every instinct screaming to flee, but the path behind him had vanished, replaced by writhing, pulsating flesh that sealed the way. Before him, the well glowed faintly, a sickly, bioluminescent red, pulsing in rhythm with something ancient and terrible deep below. The canyon was alive. And it was feeding. Ray swallowed hard, the taste of blood and fear thick in his mouth. There was no escape. The canyon had claimed Ellie, and Ray was left alone. His body trembling, soaked with sweat and the coppery taste of blood thick on his tongue, every instinct screaming in futile protest against the nightmare that had swallowed them whole. The walls around him pulsed and writhed, the flesh still breathing, slick and slicker, veins twisting like serpents beneath translucent skin. The canyon was a living beast, a grotesque labyrinth of blood and bone that had waited for centuries beneath the sun-baked earth, hungry for flesh and terror. Ray's eyes darted desperately as the path before him warped into a twisting maze of sharp, jagged bones jutting from the walls, their surfaces slick with viscous fluids that dripped down like morbid icicles, pooling into dark crimson puddles that steamed in the oppressive heat. The air was thick and suffocating, carrying the stench of death, decay, and ancient rot, a smell that clawed at Ray's throat and lodged itself in his lungs. His breath came ragged, his legs shaking with exhaustion and fear, but he forced himself onward, driven by a single, raw impulse, survival. The labyrinth groaned and shifted, the bones grinding against each other with a sickening rasp, rearranging the maze with cruel caprice, blocking paths and opening others as if the canyon itself were toying with him, playing a deadly game with a helpless pawn. Every turn revealed new horrors. Twisted skeletal remains of those who'd come before, their bones snapped and rearranged in perverse mosaics, skulls crushed and mouths frozen in silent screams, ribs intertwined like cages and spines curved into impossible arches. Pools of coagulated blood filled hollowed caverns, and from the darkness emerged glistening, writhing forms, fleshless hands clawing at Ray's ankles, grotesque limbs made of sinew and bone grasping at the shadows. He screamed, slashing wildly at the grasping hands with the jagged shard of rock he'd picked up, but they kept coming, dozens, hundreds, an endless swarm of ancient dead, bound to the canyon's will, their hollow eye sockets burning with a cold, malevolent intelligence. And then he saw it. A vast chamber ahead, its walls covered in carvings so ancient they seemed to bleed with their own dark power. Figures of twisted men and beasts entwined in eternal agony, faces screaming silent curses, and at the center a throne of bone and sinew that pulsed with living darkness. From that throne rose a figure, a monstrous entity whose very presence warped the air around it. Its body was a patchwork of flesh and bone, stitched crudely with blackened sinew and dripping with blood that never dried. Its eyes were hollow pits of void, yet somehow it saw everything, and its mouth stretched in a rictus grin of jagged teeth that dripped with a thick, black ichor. Ray stumbled backward, terror rooting him to the spot even as the creature advanced, its limbs jerking with unnatural spasms, claws scraping against the bone floor with a sound like tearing metal. "You came," it hissed, voice a grinding rasp that echoed through the chamber like a death knell. "You came to feed the hollow. To sate the hunger beneath." Ray's mind screamed for escape, but his body was frozen in primal fear. "Please," he begged, voice cracking. "Let me go." I didn't mean," the creature's grin widened impossibly. It reached out, and Ray felt the cold touch of death itself brush his skin. The chamber shuddered violently as the walls closed in, bones snapping and flesh pulsing like a heartbeat gone mad. The labyrinth was collapsing, folding in on itself to bury its prize. Ray felt claws pierce his flesh, ripping, tearing. Pain exploded through him as the creature pulled him close, sinking sharp teeth into his shoulder, dragging him down into the dark maw of the hollow. His screams were cut off, swallowed by the endless hunger of the canyon. And as the earth settled, the desert sun shone cold and indifferent over Blackthorn Canyon, silent once more. Its secret appetite sated for now, waiting for the next to wander too close, to listen to the whispers beneath the stone, and to join the hollow below.